She never meant to catch his eye, but one fleeting moment changed everything. Sophia, a poor girl struggling to survive, unknowingly captivated billionaire Alexander when she used his car window as a mirror. One glance, one spark, and his heart was never the same. What happens next will leave you breathless. The city hummed with life, honking cars, hurried footsteps, and the scent of freshly baked bread from street vendors, blending with the sharp sting of exhaust fumes. The sky was a soft shade of gray, promising rain. Among the bustling crowd, Sophia Carter, a 23-year-old woman, hurried down the pavement, clutching her worn-out handbag against her chest. She had just finished her morning shift at a local diner, her third job in the last 6 months. Her uniform, though neatly pressed in the morning, now carried faint traces of coffee spills and grease stains. She didn't have time to care. Her mind was already racing to her next task, getting home to check on her mother before heading to her evening job at the cafe. Her back ached, her feet burned, but she pushed forward. This was her life, hard, unrelenting, but hers. As she reached the traffic light, she caught her reflection in the tinted window of a sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom, parked by the curb. The car screamed wealth, its polished surface gleaming despite the overcast sky. She could see herself clearly in the mirror-like window, messy strands of hair escaping her loose ponytail, dark circles beneath her tired brown eyes, and the slight crease of worry on her forehead. She sighed and quickly reached for her collar, trying to adjust her blouse. The strap of her bra had slipped down her shoulder again. Frustrated, she bit her lip and pulled the strap back into place, smoothing the fabric over her chest. What she didn't know was that someone was watching her. Inside the Rolls-Royce, Alexander Carter, the billionaire CEO of Carter Enterprises, sat in the back seat of his luxury car, waiting for the light to turn green. His fingers tapped impatiently against his knee as he checked his phone, skimming through endless messages from business partners and women trying to win his attention. He was bored. His life was a carefully orchestrated routine: meetings, charity events, high-end parties filled with women wearing expensive perfume, and fake smiles. None of it excited him anymore. Everything felt artificial. Then, movement outside the window caught his eye. He looked up and saw her, a young woman, oblivious to the world, adjusting her bra strap, using his car window as a mirror. Alexander's lips twitched into an amused smirk. He should have been indifferent, but there was something about the scene that captivated him. It wasn't just the innocence of the act, it was her expression. There was no vanity in her reflection, no self-obsession like the women he knew. Instead, there was exhaustion, resilience, and a quiet kind of beauty. His amusement deepened when their eyes suddenly met. Sophia froze. Her cheeks flushed a deep shade of red as she realized someone was inside the car. Not just anyone, a strikingly handsome man with piercing blue eyes and an unreadable expression. For a second, neither of them moved. Sophia's heart thundered in her chest. Embarrassment clawed at her stomach. She had just, oh God, used a billionaire's luxury car as a mirror to fix her bra. Heat rushed to her face. She wanted the ground to swallow her whole. Without thinking, she blurted out, I wasn't. It's not. Oh, forget it. And then she ran. Alexander's reaction. Amusement turns to fascination. Alexander watched as the girl disappeared into the crowd, her long dark hair bouncing with every hurried step. He chuckled, a genuine amused chuckle, something he hadn't done in a long time. Interesting, he murmured under his breath. Sir. His driver, Michael, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Alexander shook his head, still smirking. Who was that girl? He should have forgotten about her, but he didn't. As the car moved forward, Alexander leaned back, still thinking about the way her brown eyes widened in panic when their gazes met. For the first time in years, he felt something that had nothing to do with business deals or wealth, curiosity. And just like that, Sophia, the girl who had unknowingly captured his attention, had no idea that she had just entered the life of one of the most powerful men in the city. The city had moved on, but Alexander Carter hadn't. Sitting in his corner office at Carter Enterprises, he should have been reviewing financial reports or finalizing a billion-dollar acquisition deal, but instead, his mind kept replaying the unexpected moment from earlier that day. The girl standing outside his car, lost in her own world, adjusting her bra strap with complete innocence. It had been a fleeting encounter, but something about her stayed with him. Her eyes, the way they widened in shock, the deep blush that spread across her cheeks, the way she had fled, embarrassed and flustered. He had spent his life surrounded by women who posed for attention, who tried too hard to impress him. But this girl, she wasn't trying at all, and yet, she had captivated him. Sophia's world, trying to forget him. Sophia stormed into her tiny apartment, still mortified beyond belief. Her mother, Margaret Carter, sat on the couch, wrapped in an old blanket, her fragile frame looking even smaller today. She had been battling a chronic illness for years, and Sophia had taken on the responsibility of caring for her, working multiple jobs, just to keep the roof over their heads. "Sweetheart, why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" her mother asked weakly. Sophia groaned, throwing herself onto the couch. "Worse than a ghost, a billionaire." Margaret blinked. "I'm sorry, what? It's so embarrassing. I used a car window as a mirror to fix my bra strap, and guess what? There was a man inside the car, watching me." Her mother chuckled softly. "Oh dear, and this billionaire, was he handsome?" Sophia huffed. "That is not the point, Mom." Margaret just smiled knowingly, but Sophia shook her head, trying to erase those piercing blue eyes from her mind. "He probably forgot about me already," she mumbled, but she was so wrong. Alexander's search, an obsession, begins for the next few days. Alexander found himself distracted. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she worked, but something inside him wouldn't let him forget her. "Michael," he finally said to his driver, after 2 days of restless thoughts. "Yes, sir. The girl from the other day. Find her." Michael blinked. "Sir, there were hundreds of people on that street. Do you have any details about her?" Alexander hesitated for a moment. She was wearing a diner uniform. She looked exhausted but beautiful. Michael lifted a brow. "That narrows it down to about 20 diners in that area. I'll start looking." Alexander nodded, feeling an unfamiliar rush of excitement. He had never chased after a woman before, but this one, he wasn't letting her disappear so easily. A sudden meeting, the moment that changes everything. 2 days later, Sophia was balancing a tray filled with coffee cups and plates at the small cafe where she worked her evening shift. She was exhausted, her feet aching, but she forced herself to smile at the customers. Tips meant survival. Just as she was placing an order down, she felt an unusual silence fall over the cafe. The usual chatter died down. Whispers started. She frowned and turned her head, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing by the entrance was him, Alexander Carter, in an expensive black suit, his presence commanding the room. He wasn't just rich. He exuded power, confidence and authority. A man who was used to getting what he wanted, and right now, his gaze was locked on her. Sophia's pulse raced. What was he doing here? A bold move. Alexander takes control. Alexander stepped forward, ignoring the stunned expressions of the other cafe customers. Sophia felt her heart hammering as he reached her table, his piercing gaze never leaving hers. "Excuse me," she said, forcing her voice to be steady. "Can I help you?" A smirk played at the corners of his lips. "Yes, actually, I'd like to take you to dinner." The tray almost slipped from her hands. The cafe went completely silent. Sophia stared at him in shock. "Excuse me, dinner with me?" A mixture of confusion, disbelief, and a strange thrill rushed through her. She placed her tray down and crossed her arms, glaring at him. "Listen, Mr. Billionaire, I don't know what kind of games you're playing, but—" "No games," he interrupted smoothly. "I want to know you." Sophia's breath hitched. This couldn't be happening. This kind of thing didn't happen to girls like her. And yet, here he was. The entire cafe was dead silent. Every customer, every worker had stopped what they were doing to stare at the scene unfolding before them. Sophia's breath felt caught in her chest. This isn't real. This can't be real. She blinked at the man standing in front of her. Alexander Carter, a billionaire, a man whose presence alone demanded attention, and he had just asked her out to dinner, in front of everyone. Sophia's internal battle, a war between heart and logic. Her heart pounded as she tried to process the situation. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander smirked slightly, as if amused by her disbelief. "I wouldn't be standing here if I weren't." She clenched her fists. "I don't know what kind of joke this is, but does it look like I'm joking?" He cut in smoothly, his deep voice sending a strange shiver down her spine. Sophia inhaled sharply. No, he wasn't joking. But why? Why would a man like him, a billionaire, a powerful CEO, someone who could have any woman he wanted, suddenly be interested in her? She felt exposed, vulnerable, like she was being played with. "I don't know what you want from me," she said, crossing her arms protectively, "but I'm not a part of your world. I'm just a waitress, struggling to pay rent. We have nothing in common." Alexander didn't blink. "I don't care about that." Sophia's lips parted slightly, shocked by his bluntness. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "Maybe it doesn't, but it doesn't have to." Alexander took a step closer, lowering his voice, so only she could hear. "I can't stop thinking about you, Sophia, and I don't know why, but I want to find out." Her heart skipped a beat. This was dangerous territory. She couldn't afford to be distracted. But his words, his voice, the way he was looking at her like she was the only woman in the world, it was making her defenses crumble. The cafe's reaction, whispers and stares behind her. People were whispering, "Is that really Alexander Carter? Why is he talking to her? Did she save his life or something? Maybe she's secretly rich." Sophia's face burned. She hated being the center of attention. She hated that people were assuming she was special, when in reality, she was just a normal girl with a messy life. She clenched her jaw and lifted her chin, forcing herself to stay strong. "I don't think your world and mine should mix," she said, taking a step back. "You should leave." For the first time something flickered across Alexander's face. Surprise. Clearly, he wasn't used to hearing. "No, are you always this stubborn?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Sophia narrowed her eyes. "Are you always this persistent?" Alexander chuckled, a low rich sound that sent warmth through her body. "Only when something or someone interests me." Sophia's breath hitched. This man was dangerous, not because he was a billionaire, but because he was making her feel things she shouldn't be feeling. "I have work to do," she said firmly. For a moment, she thought he would argue, but instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, pulled out a small black card, and placed it on the counter beside her. "My number," he said. "Call me when you change your mind." Before she could protest, he turned and walked away, his powerful presence disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. The cafe remained silent for a few seconds, then chaos. People rushed to Sophia's side, bombarding her with questions. "Do you know him? Are you secretly dating a billionaire? Did you win some kind of lottery for rich men?" Sophia groaned, pressing a hand to her forehead. This was a disaster. She grabbed the black card and shoved it into her pocket, hoping never to look at it again. But deep inside her heart, she knew she would. Alexander's thoughts, a challenge.
he can't ignore. As his car drove through the city, Alexander leaned back against the leather seat, a rare smile playing on his lips. She had rejected him, not in a flirtatious, hard-to-get kind of way, not in an "I'll say no, but secretly want you to chase me" kind of way. No, she had genuinely rejected him, and he loved it. She wasn't like anyone he had met before. She wasn't impressed by money. She wasn't flattered by power. She didn't fall into his arms like every other woman did. Instead, she stood her ground. She looked him in the eye and walked away. And that was exactly why. He wasn't giving up. Sophia's inner conflict, a night of restless thoughts. That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her small bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mother's soft breathing, the only sound in the apartment. Her fingers brushed against her pocket, where his business card still sat. She bit her lip. Why did this feel so complicated? Most women would have jumped at the opportunity. A billionaire, showing interest, a dream come true. But Sophia wasn't most women. She had spent her entire life struggling, fighting, learning to rely on herself and no one else. Letting a man like Alexander in, that was dangerous. Because if she let herself care, if she let herself fall, she wouldn't survive the heartbreak. But no matter how hard she tried to push him away, her heart was already betraying her. Days passed. Sophia tried her best to forget about Alexander Carter. She poured herself into work, taking extra shifts, keeping herself so busy that she didn't have time to think. But no matter how much she tried, she couldn't forget. She couldn't forget the intensity of his gaze, the deep rich sound of his voice, the way he had looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. And worse, she couldn't forget the card burning a hole in her pocket. She hadn't thrown it away. She told herself it was because she didn't want to be rude. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't ready to let go of him. Not yet. A surprise that leaves her speechless. It was a normal evening. At the cafe, the rush hour crowd had died down, and Sophia was wiping down tables, lost in her thoughts. Then the door opened, and he walked in. Alexander. The entire cafe stilled. It was just like the last time. Customers stared, whispering, nudging each other. But this time, he wasn't alone. A man in a sharp black suit followed him, holding a bouquet of crimson roses. Sophia's heart stopped. She barely had time to react before the suited man stepped forward and placed the bouquet in her hands. Her fingers trembled around the soft petals. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander smiled, his gaze locked onto hers. A small gesture, a thank you. Sophia's eyes widened. "For what?" He tilted his head. "For reminding me that not everything can be bought." Her heart fluttered, then immediately sank. Was this some kind of game to him? She set the roses down on the counter and folded her arms. "You're wasting your time," she said firmly. His smirk deepened. "Am I?" "Yes," she snapped. "I don't need flowers. I don't need grand gestures. I'm not a woman who can be impressed by money." Alexander finished for her, his expression unreadable. She swallowed hard. "Exactly." Something in his eyes softened. "I know," he said, his voice quieter this time. "That's why I'm here." A date proposal like no other. Sophia's pulse raced. "What do you mean?" she asked warily. Alexander took a step closer, so close she could feel the warmth of his presence. "I want to know you," he said, his voice deep, smooth, sincere. "Not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, just as a man who hasn't been able to get you out of his mind since the day he met you." Sophia's breath hitched. How was it possible for words to feel this dangerous? She looked away, her hands trembling. "I don't belong in your world, Alexander," she whispered. "Then let me step into yours." She turned back to him, stunned. He meant it. "I don't want to take you to some fancy restaurant," he continued. "I don't want you to feel out of place. Just give me one evening, one chance." She opened her mouth to argue, but for once, no words came out. "Have dinner with me," Alexander said. "Somewhere simple, somewhere you're comfortable. No pressure, just a conversation. Sophia's heart pounded against her ribs. Edith said, this wasn't what she had expected. She had thought he would try to show off, to impress her with diamonds and private jets, but instead, he wanted to step into her world, and that was terrifying, because for the first time, she felt herself losing control. The answer that shakes his world. She stared at him, her mind battling with her heart. Every instinct told her to say no, to push him away, to protect herself before she got hurt. But then, she thought about the way he had looked at her that first night, the way he had listened to her, the way he had respected her when she told him to leave, and most of all, she thought about the way her heart raced every time she saw him. So against all logic, against all reason, she said the one thing she never thought she would. Okay. Alexander's eyes darkened, something unreadable flickering behind them. Okay, he repeated, almost as if he hadn't expected her to agree. Sophia swallowed hard. One dinner, that's all. A slow, breathtaking smile curved on his lips. One dinner, he agreed, for now. And with that, the game between them truly began. The moment Sophia said, okay, she felt her world shift. A simple dinner, one night, that's all she had agreed to. Yet, as she stood in front of her tiny bedroom mirror that evening, her heart wouldn't stop racing. She had spent the past hour debating whether she should cancel, because this wasn't just dinner, this was dangerous. She had seen how rich men worked. They played with hearts like a game, and women like her, women who came from nothing, were just temporary distractions. I won't be a distraction. And yet, when she thought about Alexander's eyes, filled with something deeper than desire, something like admiration, she couldn't walk away. A date, unlike any other. At 7 p.m. sharp, a sleek black car pulled up in front of her apartment. But it wasn't a limousine. It wasn't a flashy sports car. It was a simple black sedan. Sophia stepped out of the building hesitantly, expecting a driver to open the door. Instead, Alexander himself stepped out, dressed in a casual button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, a hint of stubble on his jaw. He looked different, less like a billionaire, more like a man. For the first time, Sophia saw him not as Alexander Carter, the untouchable CEO, but as someone real, and that realization terrified her. You look beautiful, he said, his voice smooth, warm, unguarded. Sophia almost forgot to breathe. Her dress was nothing special, just a simple navy blue sundress she had bought on sale. But the way Alexander looked at her, it made her feel like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. The unexpected destination. She expected him to take her to some exclusive rooftop restaurant, the kind where a single meal cost more than her entire rent. Instead, he drove her to a tiny food truck, parked by the river. Sophia blinked. This is our dinner, she asked, looking at him in disbelief. Alexander smirked, surprised. You're a billionaire, and you could be eating at a Michelin-starred restaurant right now. I could. He leaned against the car, hands in his pockets, but you wouldn't be comfortable. There, Sophia's lips parted, but no words came out. He had really listened to her. No showing off, no extravagant gestures, just this, just him meeting her where she was, and somehow, that was more dangerous than anything else. Laughter, ice cream, and something more. They ordered tacos, and sat on a wooden bench by the river. Sophia took the first bite, and immediately groaned. This is so good, she mumbled through a mouthful. Alexander chuckled, watching her with amusement. That good, huh? She narrowed her eyes at him. You don't know good food until you eat from a truck, I stand corrected. He took a bite of his own taco, and hummed in appreciation. Okay, you win. This is incredible. Sophia smirked. Told you. For the next hour, they ate, talked, and laughed. Not about money, not about business, not about anything heavy. Just silly things, like their worst cooking disasters, like the time Sophia had burned instant noodles and almost set her kitchen on fire, like the time Alexander had tried to impress a girl in high school by cooking steak. only to realize he had no idea how to cook steak. Sophia laughed so hard, she almost choked on her drink. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like this. And when he reached forward and gently wiped a drop of sauce off her lip with his thumb, she forgot to breathe. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a brief terrifying moment, she wanted him to kiss her. The moment that changes everything. After dinner, they walked along the riverbank, an ice cream cone in each hand. The city lights reflected off the water, the air filled with the soft hum of distant laughter and music. Sophia licked her ice cream, stealing a glance at Alexander. There was something different about him tonight. He wasn't the same man who had walked into her cafe like he owned the world. He was softer. You know, he murmured, staring at the river. This is the most normal night I've had in years. Sophia's brow furrowed. Normal, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. My life isn't normal, Sophia. She stayed silent, letting him speak. Everywhere I go, people see the billionaire first. They see the power, the wealth. They want something from me. But you, he turned to her, his gaze intense, unguarded. You don't want anything from me. Sophia's heart pounded as she looked away, suddenly overwhelmed. I don't know how to exist in your world, Alexander. Then let me exist in you. Her breath hitched. Before she could reply, a raindrop fell on her nose, then another. Within seconds, the sky opened up, drenching them in a sudden downpour. Sophia shrieked, laughing as she tried to shield herself. But Alexander, he just stood there, soaking wet, staring at her like she was the most breathtaking thing he had ever seen. And then, before she could think, before she could stop herself, she took a step closer. So did he. Their breaths mingled, their skin tingled. And just like that, Alexander Carter kissed her. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't demanding. It was soft, warm, full of emotions she wasn't ready for. And yet, she kissed him back, even though she knew she was falling into something dangerous, even though she knew this would change everything. The kiss was supposed to be a mistake. It was supposed to be a moment of weakness. And yet, as Sophia stood there, her heart racing, rain soaking through her dress, her lips still tingling from Alexander's touch, she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. All she could do was stare into his deep, penetrating eyes, searching for something, anything, that would make this easier. Tell me it didn't mean anything. Tell me it was just the rain, the moment, the night. But Alexander, he didn't look away. He didn't even blink. Instead, he lifted a hand, gently tucking a strand of wet hair behind her ear. His fingertips brushed her skin, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. And then he said the one thing she wasn't ready to hear. Tell me you didn't feel it too. Sophia's breath hitched. Her fingers clenched at her sides. She should say no. She should turn around and run before she made a mistake she could never undo. But how could she, when every part of her, every cell, every heartbeat, was screaming, yes, running away from desire? Sophia took a step back, her pulse pounding so loudly she could barely hear herself think. I should go, she whispered, voice barely audible over the rain. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, watching as she turned around and walked away, her heart shattering with every step. She didn't know how she made it home. She didn't know how she managed to climb up the stairs to her tiny apartment, her dress clinging to her like a second skin. All she knew was that the moment she locked the door behind her, she pressed her fingers to her lips and closed her eyes. Because that kiss, it had felt too real, too dangerous, too undeniable. And Sophia Winters wasn't supposed to fall for a man like Alexander Carter. She wasn't supposed to feel this, but she did, and that terrified her. The man who couldn't let go. Alexander didn't sleep that night.
He sat in his penthouse, his mind replaying the kiss, over and over again, the way she had looked at him, the way her breath had hitched when he touched her, the way she had melted into him before reality crashed down on her. He could still feel the rain on his skin, the warmth of her lips, the undeniable connection between them. And yet, she had walked away. She had run. Alexander Carter wasn't used to women running from him. He was used to being in control. He was used to getting what he wanted, but with Sophia, nothing was in his control anymore, and that both infuriated and fascinated him, because deep down, he knew she wanted him too, and he wasn't about to let her go. The morning after Sophia tried to go back to her normal life, she went to work at the cafe, pretending everything was fine, pretending she hadn't spent the entire night, tossing and turning, unable to forget his touch. But the moment she walked through the door, her world stopped, because sitting at one of the corner tables, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, watching her with an intensity that made her knees weak, was Alexander Carter. Sophia's heart slammed against her ribs. What was he doing here? How did he even find this place? As if reading her mind, Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with something undeniable. You walked away last night, Sophia. Her fingers tightened around the tray in her hands. You kissed me, Alexander, she whispered, barely able to breathe. That wasn't supposed to happen. His lips curled into a smirk, but his eyes, they were dead serious. It wasn't supposed to happen. He tilted his head. Then why did it feel so right? Sophia's stomach flipped. Why was he making this so hard? Before she could respond, a co-worker nudged her. Sophia, order for table 3. She swallowed hard, turning away before she could say something stupid, before she could admit the truth. But even as she worked, even as she tried to ignore him, she could feel Alexander's eyes on her, watching, waiting, and when she finally gathered the courage to look at him again, he lifted his coffee cup in a silent challenge. A promise. This isn't over, Sophia. And in that moment, she knew it wasn't. It never would be. Sophia wanted to run, but where would she go? Because no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that Alexander Carter didn't matter, that their kiss was a mistake, her heart betrayed her. Every stolen glance, every brush of his fingers, every time she closed her eyes, she felt him. And now, he was sitting in her cafe, watching her like he knew every single one of her thoughts. She tried to focus on work, tried to ignore the way her pulse hammered in her throat, but it was useless, because the moment she turned around, he was standing right in front of her. Sophia's breath hitched. Alexander had moved so silently that she hadn't even noticed. But now, he was so close that she could feel the heat radiating off him, and the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. You're avoiding me. His voice was calm, smooth, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Sophia swallowed. I'm working, she mumbled, gripping the tray in her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Alexander's lips quirked into a slow, knowing smirk. And last night, were you working then too? Sophia's stomach flipped. He wasn't going to let her push this away, and she hated that a part of her didn't want him to. The dance of denial. Sophia glanced around nervously. People were watching, her co-workers, customers. She couldn't afford to be seen in a heated conversation with a billionaire, not when she was just a poor waitress struggling to get by. Alexander, she whispered, her voice laced with warning, this isn't the place for, then come with me. Her heart stopped. I can't, she stammered, shaking her head. I have a shift, and this isn't a conversation we should even be having. But Alexander wasn't letting her escape that easily. He leaned in, his lips dangerously close to her ear, and whispered, You're scared. Sophia's breath caught. His words pierced through her defenses like a blade. You think if you ignore what happened, it'll go away. His voice was softer now, taunting. To tell me, Sophia, how many times did you think about me last night? Her hands trembled, because the truth was, she hadn't stopped thinking about him. Not for a single second, but she couldn't admit that. Not when she knew the kind of power
Alexander had over her, so instead, she did the only thing she could. She forced herself to lie. Not once, she whispered. Alexander's jaw clenched, his eyes darkened, and for a split second, Sophia thought he would call her bluff. But instead, he smirked, a slow, dangerous smirk that sent a shiver down her spine. "Then why?" he murmured, voice dripping with amusement. "Are your hands shaking?" Sophia froze. She immediately dropped the tray, crossing her arms over her chest, as if that would hide how much he affected her. But it was too late. He had seen, he had felt, and Alexander Carter was a man who never walked away from a challenge, especially not when it involved her. The test of willpower. The cafe was busy. Customers were buzzing. Orders were flying. And Sophia tried her hardest to focus on anything but the man who sat patiently in the corner. He stayed for hours, sipping his coffee, watching her, not saying another word. And that was the worst part, because Alexander's silence was more dangerous than anything he could have said. It was like a challenge, daring her to acknowledge what was between them, daring her to face the truth. And the longer he stayed, the harder it became to ignore the way her heart betrayed her. A moment of weakness. By the time Sophia's shift ended, her head was spinning. She had spent the entire day pretending like he wasn't there, like his presence wasn't suffocating her. But now, as she grabbed her coat and stepped outside, she found herself alone. The rain had started again, soft and steady, casting a cold mist over the empty street. For a brief moment, she thought maybe, just maybe, Alexander had left, that he had finally given up. But then, a sleek black car pulled up beside her, the tinted window rolling down to reveal him. Alexander Carter, sitting in the driver's seat, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Get in," he said. Sophia's pulse skipped. This was a bad idea, a terrible idea. She should turn around, she should walk away, but her feet wouldn't move, because deep down, she knew, she had been running from him for too long. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to run anymore. Sophia stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at the open car door. She shouldn't get in, she should walk away. But every fiber of her being was screaming at her to take that step, to stop fighting the pull that had been dragging her toward Alexander, since the moment their eyes met through that car window. And then, as if sensing her hesitation, he spoke. "Just a drive, Sophia." His voice was smooth, deep, a promise and a challenge, all at once. The rain trickled down, dampening her clothes, and before she could think twice, she moved. She slid into the car, shutting the door behind her, sealing her fate. A drive into the unknown. The moment the door clicked shut, a tension settled between them, thick and unbearable. Sophia could feel the heat of Alexander's presence, even though he kept his hands firmly on the wheel. His jaw was clenched, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if he was battling something within himself. The car purred to life, and they pulled into the street. The city lights, reflecting off the rain-slicked roads. Silence stretched between them. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was charged. Every breath, every stolen glance, every second that passed without words, felt like a pulling string, tightening, tensing, begging to snap. Sophia's hands curled into her lap. She needed to say something, anything to break the suffocating tension. But before she could, Alexander spoke. "Why do you keep running from me?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. Sophia swallowed. "Because you're dangerous." Alexander let out a soft chuckle, low and knowing. "To you, or to your heart?" Her breath hitched. He was right, and that terrified her. A confession beneath the stars. The car slowed to a stop. Sophia blinked, startled to find them parked at a secluded overlook, the entire city sprawling below, like a sea of shimmering lights. The rain had stopped, the sky had cleared, revealing a dark velvet canvas sprinkled with stars. Alexander turned off the engine, but made no move to leave. Instead, he turned toward her, his piercing gaze searching hers. "Tell me to take you home," he murmured. Sophia's breath caught, because she couldn't. She didn't want to go home. She wanted this, whatever this was. Alexander leaned in slightly, his scent, that intoxicating blend of musk and something undeniably him, invading her senses. "Tell me you don't feel this." His voice was a whisper now, husky and dangerously close. Sophia's lips parted, but no words came out. Because how could she lie? How could she pretend when every inch of her was aching for him? The small knowing smile tugged at the corner of Alexander's lips. "That's what I thought." And then, he reached for her, a kiss that changed everything. The moment his fingers brushed her cheek, the world stopped. Sophia should have pulled away. She should have resisted. But when his thumb traced the curve of her jaw, gentle, yet possessive, she melted. Her breath came in soft, shallow gasps as he leaned in, his lips mere inches from hers. "I've wanted to do this since the moment I saw you through that car window," he whispered. A shiver ran down her spine. And then, his lips met hers, soft at first, testing, a question rather than a demand. But the moment Sophia responded, it ignited a slow burning hunger that neither of them could control. His hand slid into her hair, pulling her closer. Sophia's fingers gripped his shirt, holding on like he was the only thing keeping her grounded. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the past, not the future, just this undeniable, unstoppable, earth-shattering connection. The aftermath of a kiss, when they finally broke apart. Their breaths were ragged, their foreheads resting against each other. Sophia's heart was pounding, her entire body was buzzing. Alexander cupped her face, his touch impossibly tender. "Tell me you regret it," he murmured. But she couldn't, because for the first time in a long time, she didn't regret anything. The air inside the car was thick with unspoken emotions, the aftermath of their kiss, still crackling like electricity between them. Sophia's lips were warm, swollen, trembling, not just from Alexander's touch, but from the realization of what just happened, what she had allowed to happen. Her heart was still pounding against her ribs, echoing his name in every beat. But then, reality crashed in. She pulled away, her breath uneven, her hands shaking, as she tried to form words. "I can't do this." Alexander's jaw tightened, his gaze, usually so composed, flickered with something raw, something dangerous. "Why not?" His voice was low, restrained, but there was an unmistakable ache beneath it. Sophia squeezed her eyes shut. How could she explain? How could she tell him that she wasn't the kind of woman who belonged in his world? That she had spent her whole life struggling, fighting, surviving, while he had everything at his fingertips. She opened her mouth, but the words tangled inside her throat. Then, softly, he cupped her chin, tilting her face back toward him. "Sophia," he murmured, his voice like a caress. "Tell me you don't feel this. Tell me that kiss meant nothing." Her heart twisted, because she couldn't. It meant everything. She had spent her whole life building walls, protecting herself from pain, from false hope, from men like him. But Alexander had slipped through the cracks of her defenses. He was dangerous, not because he was rich, not because he was powerful, but because he made her feel. And that was the scariest thing of all. The escape that didn't feel like freedom. "I need to go home," she whispered, forcing herself to look away. Alexander studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching hers, as if trying to read every secret she had buried inside her soul. Then, without a word, he started the car. The drive back was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was tense, heavy. Sophia stole glances at him, his grip on the steering wheel too tight, his jaw locked as though he was fighting a storm within himself. She knew she was hurting him, and yet, the deeper truth was, she was hurting herself even more. The car slowed as they reached her small, dimly lit neighborhood. Sophia's chest ached at the contrast, his luxurious world, and her crumbling reality. Alexander pulled up in front of her apartment, his hands still gripping the wheel, his knuckles white. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was almost unbearable. Sophia reached for the door handle, but before she could step out, Alexander's voice stopped her. The promise that shook her soul. If you walk away from me now, Sophia. His voice was low, edged with something almost painful. She turned to him, her throat tightening, at the way he looked at her, as if she was slipping through his fingers. Will you come back? He finished, his words barely above a whisper. Sophia's heart clenched. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to promise him that she wouldn't run, that she wouldn't push him away when she was already falling into him. But she was terrified, so instead, she swallowed the lump in her throat and whispered, "Good night, Alexander." And with that, she stepped out of the car. The cold air bit at her skin, but it wasn't nearly as chilling as the feeling of leaving him behind. She didn't turn back. She didn't dare. But as she reached her apartment door, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the key, she felt it, that deep sinking feeling in her chest. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and she knew Alexander wouldn't let this be the end. The apartment door closed behind her, but the storm inside Sophia's heart was far from over. Her back pressed against the wooden surface, and she let out a deep, shaky breath. She had walked away. She had left him sitting there, in his sleek car, with his intense gaze, that had pleaded for something she was too afraid to give. Her hands clenched into fists. Why did it hurt so much? She had spent years learning how to survive on her own, years building a wall, so no man could ever have the power to break her. But Alexander had stepped into her life like a raging storm, breaking down the walls she thought were impenetrable. And the worst part, she didn't even want to stop him. Alexander's turmoil. A man who never had to chase Alexander sat in his car, staring at the building Sophia had disappeared into. His hands were gripping the wheel so tightly, his knuckles had turned white. This feeling, it was foreign to him. Women had always come to him, effortlessly. He never had to chase, never had to beg for time, for attention. And yet, here he was, sitting alone in his car, with a hollow ache in his chest, because the one woman he truly wanted had just walked away. Not because she didn't care, but because she was scared. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, frustration burning in his veins. He wasn't a fool. He had seen it in her eyes. The longing, the struggle. She wanted him just as much as he wanted her. So why was she fighting it? His jaw clenched. This wasn't over. He had never backed down from a fight in his life. And he wasn't about to start now. A sleepless night, and a desperate heart. Sophia tossed and turned in bed, but sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, his hands on her face, his lips brushing against hers. The way his voice had trembled when he asked, "Will you come back?" A tear slipped down her cheek. Why did it feel like she had left a part of herself behind? Her heart was screaming at her to stop fighting, but her mind was filled with doubt. What if this isn't real? What if I'm just a challenge to him? What if I end up hurt? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from the whirlwind of her thoughts. Her pulse spiked when she saw his name flashing on the screen. Alexander. She swallowed hard. Her fingers hovered over the phone. She should ignore it. She should. But her heart had other plans. With trembling hands, she picked up. The moment she whispered, "Hello," his deep, ragged voice sent a shiver down her spine. The words that changed everything. "I couldn't sleep," Alexander admitted, his voice low, rough, filled with something deep. Sophia's breath caught. She couldn't either. But she didn't say that. Instead, she whispered, "You shouldn't call me." Silence. "Then tell me to stop," Alexander murmured, his voice full of undeniable longing. "Tell me you don't want this, and I'll leave you alone." Her lips parted, but the words wouldn't come, because it was a lie. She wanted him, so much it terrified her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things left unsaid. Finally, Alexander spoke again, softer this time. "Good night, Sophia." The call ended, but the ache in her chest only deepened. She pressed the phone to her heart, her fingers tightening around it. What was she doing? Why was she running from the only thing that had ever felt so real? A decision that could change everything. Morning sunlight streamed through the tiny window of her apartment, but Sophia's heart was still restless. She knew what she had to do. She had to stop running. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her coat and rushed out the door. She had no idea what she would say, no idea if she had already ruined everything. But one thing was certain, she needed to see him. Sophia ran through the city streets, her heart pounding against her ribs. She didn't care about the people staring. She didn't care that her hair was a mess, or that her hands were trembling. All she knew was that she needed to see him, needed to tell him. She wasn't running anymore. Alexander's final attempt, or so he thought. Alexander sat in his office, staring at the city skyline. He had tried to distract himself, bury himself in work, in meetings, in anything that would make him stop thinking about her. But it was useless. Every second felt empty without her. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt helpless. What more could he do? He had laid his heart bare, given her a choice, and she had walked away. Maybe she wasn't meant to be his. Maybe he had to let her go. A sharp knock on his office door snapped him out of his thoughts. Before he could respond, the door burst open, and there she was, Sophia, breathless, flushed, her eyes wild with emotion. His heart stopped, the moment that changed everything. Sophia, he breathed, standing so quickly, his chair nearly toppled over. She took a step forward, then another, and then, before she could lose her courage, she spoke. I was scared, she confessed, her voice shaking. Scared of how much I feel for you. Scared that if I let you in, you'd destroy me. Alexander didn't move. He didn't even breathe. But her next words, they shattered everything. I love you, Alexander. A sharp, broken inhale left his lips, and then before she could even think, he was in front of her, his hands cupping her face, his touch trembling. Say it again, he whispered. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I love you. A soft, almost disbelieving laugh escaped him, and then his lips crashed against hers. It wasn't just a kiss. It was everything, every unsaid word, every fight, every moment they had denied themselves. And now, there was no going back. Forever starts now. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers. You changed my world, Sophia, he whispered, and I don't ever want to go back to a life without you. She smiled through her tears. Then don't. His arms wrapped around her, holding her as if he would never let go. And this time, he wouldn't have to.